All right, hey everyone, welcome to episode 28 of Trucksafe Live, the show where we and our guest tackle hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon, this is Jerad.
Hey everybody.
We are with Trucksafe and Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Excited to have Jerad back with me here in studio.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while. He left me out on my own to do the rest of the shows.
Well, I saw Dave was going to be on today. I didn't want to miss it, so.
Yeah, Dave brought you in, so glad for that. Before we get to today's topic, which is safety rating shakeup, we have a few things going on in Trucksafe and in the industry that are worth talking about, so let's hit those real quick. First up is our Trucksafe Boot Camp.
Yeah, October 12th and 13th, we're going to be in Orlando. We did one of these earlier in the spring this year in Indianapolis. We thought we'd go someplace a little bit warmer, so we're going to go with Orlando this fall. We have a couple of seats left. I believe we're capping attendance around 60, and so if you're interested in that, let us know.
Yep.
And we'll probably have another one here spring of 24,
yep.
And we're looking to shoot big on that one, so look for that announcement.
Yeah, so if you're interested in joining us, like Jerad said, we've got a few spots open. Trucksafebootcamp.com is where you can find information on that and where you can register. Hope to see you there. What else we got going on? So our Trucksafe Network, if you're not a member of our Trucksafe Network, we recommend you join it. It's where we offer a lot of free content on DOT compliance, articles, videos, courses. It's also a network for safety professionals to learn from one another, ask questions, that type of stuff. It's available at trucksafenetwork.com. We've also got an app in the App Store and the Google Play Store, which is what we're showing on screen. So hope to see you there digitally. So you check that out. Like I said, trucksafenetwork.com. Last thing I'll mention about Trucksafe is our newsletter. If you're interested in receiving breaking industry news, our analysis of it, videos, articles, all of that fun stuff, all about DOT safety and compliance, subscribe to our newsletter over at trucksafe.com/subscribe, and you will get the latest and greatest from us for what it's worth.
And our courses too.
Courses.
Don't forget about the courses. We have a number of courses, including reasonable suspicion training. We have a safety manager course. A lot of different courses.
Hazmat.
If you haven't checked those out, check them out.
Check them out, trucksafeacademy.com. All right, enough about us. What's going on in the industry? A couple big things recently, including a couple of FMCSA notices that have come out recently. Our last show was on the last notice before the one that we're talking about today, which was a notice from FMCSA soliciting the public to submit waiver request from its meal and rest break preemption ruling. This was something that kind of came out of thin air, was not expecting it. It came down a few weeks ago now. We did a show a couple weeks ago with Doug Graw, transportation attorney Doug Graw of the Graw Group, where we broke it down and what exactly the FMCSA is thinking about doing with meal and rest breaks. It's pretty shocking news. We've gotten used to over the last couple of years, at least for interstate regulated trucking companies, not having to worry about other states' meal and rest break laws like California's and Washington's because of FMCSA's earlier determination that those rules as applied to interstate truck drivers are preempted by the federal hours of service rules. But now the FMCSA is actively soliciting waiver request from its own ruling in that regard, meaning that it is going to accept requests for waivers from that preemption decision, likely from California and Washington labor departments. And if the FMCSA receives those requests and grants them, then those states are presumably going to be able to enforce those meal and rest break rules against interstate regulated truck drivers.
I was thinking about this. I was wondering, are we going to start seeing kind of a cyclical nature of this type of thing when we're dealing with the FMCSA going forward, depending on the administration, much like the NLRB is?
It's kind of what it seems like.
Forth?
Yeah, we've already seen that back and forth with just that meal and rest break issue. The FMCSA originally determined that California's and Washington's rules were not preempted, and then in 2018 it decided that they were preempted, and now it's going to accept waiver requests. So very well could be, seems to be pretty politically driven, but in any event, they're accepting those waiver requests, and we anticipate those states will file them. We anticipate the FMCSA will grant them, and then if you've got operations in California and or Washington, then it's going to be not fun for you. probably. So anyway, be on the lookout for more information on that. We've got an article about it on our website over at trucksafe.com, and catch that last show if you missed it. All right, so that's all that we had to talk about before we transition to today's topic, which is the advance notice of proposed rulemaking published by FMCSA last week, which was the end of August 2023, if you're watching this later. In that advance notice of proposed rulemaking, the FMCSA is soliciting public comments on an potential overhaul to the agency's safety fitness determination process, more commonly known as safety ratings. In particular, the notice suggests that the agency may be considering tying a motor carrier safety rating to its CSA scores, which is something that it tried to do back in 2016 before ultimately withdrawing that proposal due to outcry from the industry and a wrist slap from the U.S. Congress. So what exactly are they proposing this time, and what might it mean for fleets in the U.S.? That's what we're discussing today on today's show. And we're excited to be joined by industry veteran, Senior Vice President of Safety and Government Affairs for the Truckload Carriers Association, Mr. Dave Heller. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I'll tell you what, though, that introduction, you have to question who poked the bear over at FMCSA, right? They've just have a lot of things coming out recently, don't they?
It's been a busy month for them, for sure. And, we kind of saw this one coming because it's been in their regulatory agenda. We didn't see that meal and rest break one coming, did you?
No, I didn't. In fact, we were like, oh, this is a done deal. We put this to bed a few years back, so we're good to go on that. And all of a sudden this comes out of thin air, and it was like, okay, great. And it kind of raises that flag of where do we go as an industry if states start, getting preemptions of that interstate rule, if you will. So I hate to be one of those truck drivers who say is driving from DC up to Massachusetts in one day. How many state lines do they cross if they all have different meal and rest breaks? That would not be a fun day, to say the very least.
Yeah, especially parking shortages. We've got that problem to begin with. Now we've got the potential, if these waivers are granted, and this is one of the big impetus for the FMCSA's original preemption decision. You got truck drivers who now, under California's and Washington's laws, are having to potentially take 3 times as many rest breaks as they do under the federal hours of service rules. And it's hard enough to get that 1 rest break in under the federal rules. And now you're potentially having to take 3 breaks a day and find parking for that. Just eats up a ton of time and fills up the parking spots, it seems like. So.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. To me, it goes back to like my high school days when I used to work in like a retail establishment. And I think the rules were designed for that type of environment. It was not designed for a professional truck driver, to say the very least. So it brings us to where we are today. And they're looking at exemption requests, which is not the way to go. I don't necessarily know if FMCSA is thrilled to be going down this road either. They issued that proclamation and that, saying it's the federal rules that matter and this is what's coming up. So it goes into that caveat or that bucket, if you will, and we'll see how this plays out.
Yeah, and just thinking about all the work that they put themselves into it, granting the preemption decision, now they're going to be undoing essentially what they did just a couple years ago. So anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Well, Dave, we were just talking before we got on here. It seems like every speech I've ever given in the industry, you were also there giving a speech, a regulatory update of some sort. So if you've never had a chance to see Dave give one of those speeches, definitely get out there and see that. But tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into industry, how long you've been in the industry, and a little bit about TCA as well.
Oh, well, myself, I guess I would say it's dumb luck, if you will. Just kind of fell by the wayside. It was one of those things way back when, after I got out of college, I was working retail coming out of college, got to the point where I was like, I need to do something else. And I ended up getting a job with ATA working on programs like the National Truck Driving Championship and their Safety Management Council, which then life kind of came at me and, my career grew, and that's how I came here to TCA. And I've been at TCA for almost 18 years, if you can believe that.
Wow.
So it's been a long time, to say the very least. It's home and it's comfortable. And they're a great association. There's no doubt about it. For those that don't know TCA, we're an organization that strictly represents the truckload segment of the industry. They're over the road people. We're a growing association, to say the very least. Our membership seems to be skyrocketing these days, which is great. And, you guys are on LinkedIn and you probably keep seeing our new member notifications that continually go up and up. So it's a good position to be in, where we have a great group of members that are the best in the industry, the best hauling freight out there, safety conscience, you name it, they are the ones. So we here at TCA, we do our best to represent them on Capitol Hill and within FMCSA, and we put educational programs out there, host meetings for networking, and we have members in Canada and Mexico, so we're international to say the very least. So it's a great environment to be in.
Excellent. Yeah. And TCA usually does their big annual conference, and they also do a safety and security conference. Those are the two that happen every year. But I looked at the calendar, and you guys have piled on a lot of different events as well. It's interesting.
We do. In fact, at the end of this month, we have our fall business meetings and Call on Washington, where our membership will be coming into town here in Washington, D.C., and we'll be walking the halls of Congress talking about the issues that we'll talk about today, or we'll talk about truck parking, or we'll talk equipment. We'll run the gamut of range of topics in which we'll be having with our congressional representatives. And then again, before you know it, in November, we're going to be going north of the border to Canada, where we have our Bridging Border Barriers Conference. Because let's face it, we have Canadian members that are constantly crossing the border and coming south. So this is our one opportunity in November to go north into the frigid cold of Canada and have a meeting to talk about the stuff that matters to them. So it's a great event. It really is. And even that one is growing by leaps and bounds. So it's one of those situations where our members are embracing the messages that we're giving or that they're giving us and going from there. And no more does that show with our Call on Washington when they come into our town and speak on the issues that we get to speak on.
Yeah, for sure. If you haven't been to a TCA event, I highly recommend it. Jerad and I have been there as attendees. We've been there as speakers, and we had a booth at the last one. So it's just, they put on a great event. So check that out if you haven't already. All right, Dave. So obviously discussion today is about safety fitness determinations and the FMCSA's ANPRM on that issue specifically. For anybody who's tuned in that may not be familiar with safety fitness determinations, I was wondering if you could kind of just break down basically what they are and why they matter.
Well, the safety fitness determination, for lack of a better term, it rates that carrier in their safety performance, if you will. It rates it into one of three categories: satisfactory, conditional, and unsatisfactory. It's a program that has been around forever. As you said at the beginning of the show, it's one in which they have continually tried to update, if you will, based upon compliance reviews, and have continually tried to update it to get it a better working system. And those updates or that conversation has been going on for years. So we don't know. We obviously, because of the presence of this inexact science, here it is actually 2023, where they rolled it out again for more conversation. Previously happened in 2016. It's been on that regulatory docket for years, and they've continued to say, we're going to do something about it. We're going to do something about it. And here they're saying, we're going to do something about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll get to do something about it. I think us three guys can all sit there and say, hey, there's some shortcomings to this. And certainly the way they want to go about doing it probably is not the best case scenario. And they're looking for comments from industry to highlight the ways they want to go doing it. They want to go about doing it.
Yeah. So the existing safety rating, like you said, it's been around. The process has been around for decades at this point, as long as I can remember. And it's got its flaws. I think one of the rationales the FMCSA raised, you mentioned, when they tried to change this up a few years ago, 2016, I think was the last time they made any significant strides at it. They pointed out that the existing safety rating process, one big concern with it is that, number one, it requires a lot of manpower from the FMCSA because it requires a compliance review conducted by an investigator. So they actually have to send somebody out, or they do more and more of them offsite nowadays, and put eyes on records and spend whatever amount of time they need to look at the records. And then they go through a complex methodology of rating you in several different factors, ultimately to come down to one of three safety ratings: satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. And they do this at the direction of Congress. This is in their enabling legislation, where Congress has said that the FMCSA has to have a system or process in place for measuring the safety fitness of motor carriers, essentially. And so this has historically been the way that they have done it. But I think it's important to note that safety ratings are distinct from CSA scores. And I think some folks get those conflated. So maybe you run through kind of the distinction. What's the difference with CSA scores versus safety ratings?
Well, you're right, and that's always been the wait. Aren't they the same? And that becomes that classic, which leads to a conversation. Certainly, probably more time than we have today. But safety fitness determinant, as you said, comes from that compliance review, right? And that compliance review, unfortunately, doesn't touch everybody. In fact, we have carrier members that probably have drivers that were born after their last compliance review. They've got reviews that were still in the 90s, if you will. And so in saying that, it does take a lot to send somebody out to put eyes on what that is. And that safety fitness determination is exactly that. CSA is a whole nother ballgame, right? It involves roadside inspections and what have you, actual boots on the ground, roadside type stuff that they're pulling over, looking at the truck and judging and putting the performance on the scores that are happening at the side of the road, or actual performance as that truck is going down the roadways, if you will. So two entirely different measurements. The question becomes, and again, we can probably sit here and poke holes in just about all of them. Do they figure out a way to marry them together? I think that was their first initial thought process in 2016, which didn't work. TCA was not in favor of that then. We'll still poke holes in CSA now, even with the new CSA. And I'm dating myself here. I remember when it was CSA 2010 and first talked about. And so we'll poke holes in it again and continue to do so, because it's probably not the best way to go about doing it. And at the same point, you guys both know there's a difference between compliance and actual safety. They're not the same category. They're two entirely different subjects in its entirety. Compliance does not always equal safety, and vice versa. So that becomes the big caveat: is where do we go from here?
I think the oldest safety rating I've ever seen, you mentioned 90s. I think the oldest one I've seen recently was like an 87 or 86 safety rating. Which is just crazy.
Well, I saw a few of them just when this rule came out. I decided to just start looking, and I was like, yep, 90s. Like, you just sit there like, really? Is this really what's going on right now? So that becomes the big kicker.
The increase in regulated carriers, I mean, that's something that plays a huge factor in this conversation, just because with the FMCSA having around 1,100 employees and there being 700,000 plus regulated carriers, I mean, they have to find a way to escalate those carriers that have problematic scores. In the defense of the FMCSA a little bit, I mean, they have to figure out a way to do this, because with 1,100 employees, there's no way that they can touch even remotely close to enough.
What's the number? Carriers. Is it, Dave, you may know, what percentage of the regulated carriers have a safety rating? It's like less than 2%, isn't it?
I think it is. In fact, I think in 2019, they only did safety compliance reviews in 2% of the industry. Well, an industry that has 550,000, 560,000 motor carriers. That's not a lot of motor carriers to touch in 1 year. There needs to be a better way to do it. And there's avenues. I know, as I said earlier, somebody poked the bear at FMCSA. I mean, they're even talking about a carrier proficiency examination for new entrant carriers. And is this kind of a caveat to incorporate into this? Is there a glue that attaches these things all together so that they can touch base with new carriers that are getting into the industry, rather than the new entrants audit process that they, again, fell behind because they just don't have enough manpower to do so. So is there proficiency?
I think we should do, Dave, is we when they release that proficiency exam, I think we get all three of us together on a live show and take it and see who can score the highest.
I'm betting you guys score the highest. So my money's on you guys.
I think that'd be fun. So that's kind of the background of safety ratings. And one of the big things, aside from FMCSA not being able to audit any significant percentage of motor carriers each year, the other thing about safety ratings that can be problematic is that they are really just a snapshot of that carrier's compliance as of the date of the audit. It's essentially stale the day after the audit's complete, because it's looking backwards at records that they had available on the date of the audit. So if they've made any improvements, or if they have slipped in their compliance efforts after that audit, that safety rating has nothing to say about what has happened after the audit. So I think that's one of the big concerns. At least that's what the FMCSA's ANPRM suggested is as one of the big concerns, is that's more of a snapshot. Whereas CSA scores, as you mentioned, Dave, is more, I kind of like to view it more as like a moving picture. A more up-to-date look at the motor carrier's compliance efforts as judged by roadside inspections primarily. So that's really the distinction. But to your point, Dave, the question is the solution to the safety fitness determination issue to meld the two systems together? Are we at a place where we feel comfortable enough with CSA scores to really marry the two so that we are essentially issuing safety ratings based on CSA scores? And I know that was the proposal in 2016. And so maybe if you can give us a rundown of that 2016 rulemaking effort, because we had progressed to a notice of proposed rulemaking back then, right?
Yeah, and in fact, it was one in which they wanted to just label carriers unfit, right? It was just, you wanted a carrier to be labeled, if you weren't in compliance or weren't have good safety practices, they wanted to throw that unfit label at you and nothing else. And it became one of those situations. As you know, we have the three now. You have satisfactory, conditional, unsatisfactory. So if you were given an unfit, wasn't that the death blow, so to speak? And were you shutting down your doors? And who wants to do business with a carrier that's unfit to do business? And again, this goes back to 2016. So you're calling on my memory, which is foggy at best. But at the same point, it's one of those situations that it probably was not the best direction to go with. And I think FMCSA even realized that, because here we are, and I'm doing the math here, but 7 years later, trying to have the same conversation, albeit a little bit differently. They're looking for more input at the start of the game because it's an advance notice. They're literally just trying to get a bullseye on what that conversation looks like. And there's a lot of things out there that can go into what that carrier safety performance looks like. And where does it go from here becomes that question when it comes to filing comments on what it is that they're looking for, or what can industry do to provide a better idea of a path going forward, which is the nature of one of those advance notices.
Yeah, and that's an important point, is that this is just an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. The FMCSA is looking for industry feedback, which we strongly encourage anybody listening to this. Go in, submit your comments, give your thoughts. We've been accused of whining about this ANPRM, including by some former FMCSA officials. And I want to make it very clear that we plan to submit our own comments with our own suggestions of how this should run. We did so in 2016. I remember like it was yesterday because I just went back and read my comments from the 2016 rulemaking, and we offered a ton of suggestions back then of how we think this should play out. And that rulemaking was ultimately withdrawn. The FMCSA decided not to move forward with it, largely from what I could tell because of the concerns that were raised about the reliability of the CSA data and some of the other concerns that we've heard over the years and that we've shared over the years with the agency. But you mentioned new CSA. Talk to us about new CSA and why this may put a little wrinkle in things this time around.
Well, I mentioned new CSA, and I do so in a manner of, the changes that they made. And Jerad, you alluded to this. I go out and talk to a lot of groups in front of a lot of people, and I get a lot of carrier feedback. And so the conversations I've had with carriers under new CSA, because they've all looked at their preview scores, and I've asked them, I said, what do you think of the preview scores? What do you think of new CSA? And there's some very highly technical answers out there. A lot of them include, or so be it, or it doesn't really make much difference. Those very highly technical comments where it doesn't really matter. They don't have an opinion on what new CSA can be or what it does for them. So I think they're kind of sitting there. It doesn't change the fact of what was wrong with CSA is still what was wrong with CSA. Again, and I'm glad they didn't incorporate IRT into it, because I would hope you guys would be able to explain it, not me, because I have no idea how to do it. So my point is while they're recommending some changes with the previews and carriers have seen their preview scores, it's not like people are jumping for joy saying this is a great fix. This is something we really needed. Certainly, breaking out the maintenance aspects, certainly that is more reflective of what's going on in the industry. But at the same point, none of these are real game changers. None of these are people saying this is the best way to go. This is what we've always imagined it. No, that's not the case. It still hasn't changed some of the things that have always been wrong with CSA in the first place.
And I'll say, I mean, we've been a part of several actual DOT audits in which, we're walking in to help this carrier thinking, look at these scores, this is going to be a difficult situation here, and they end up faring well in the context of an audit. And so had you based strictly fit or unfit on just their scores, not their safety management process, they would have been deemed unfit most likely, which kind of leads me to a question here. In a long roundabout way, there has to be a remediation process with this. If you're going to tie CSA scores to the fit or unfit category, you have to have a robust remediation process for carriers. How do you think that might look? I know we don't have details on that, but what would you envision?
Oh man, you're asking me to rub the crystal ball here. And, I wish I had a vision on what that looks like, and that becomes the bigger case in point is, if you have a carrier that's been deemed unsatisfactory, what's their path out of purgatory? Because once they have that issue, who's going to do business with them in the first place? That becomes problem number one, and then keeping them profitable becomes problem number two. And let's not forget, we're going back a ways here, and we're doing so with the 2016 rulemaking, but there's still that avenue out there that was called beyond compliance that we used to always talk about. Maybe there's opportunity to incorporate some of those. We've got comments due on AED today to the agency on that rulemaking. Is there opportunity to incorporate some of that technology that carriers are using outside of compliance, outside of safety requirements, to improve the safety performance of those fleets? Maybe now's the time for that opportunity to incorporate some of these things, showing that a safer carrier is the one that's using these technologies outside of the need from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations. So there's a lot of things that go into this when you look at it, and what does coming out of purgatory look like? How do they get out of purgatory? All of these questions certainly come to mind based on the fact of this is a wide open playing field right now. I've always said carriers should never be afraid to have their safety fitness determined. They should insist it be determined correctly, and that becomes the very
due process.
Yeah, and those become
the answer is not the data queue system. I know that much because, and to your point, Dave, you said it, I think, perfectly, which is the changes that they have proposed to CSA, which haven't taken effect yet. They're all well and good. I don't have any problem with the changes that they propose necessarily, any substantial problems with it, but it doesn't get to the heart of the issues that we were concerned with CSA that caused us concern with tying a motor carrier safety rating to them. Namely, my biggest concern is the due process issue, because if we're going to tie a carrier safety rating to their CSA scores, which are premised largely on roadside inspections, how is the carrier to challenge erroneous violations from a roadside inspection that could shut them down if they get an unfit rating because of those CSA scores? And right now the answer is data queue system. And the data queue system is just, it's not the right solution. It offers no due process, no meaningful due process to the carrier. The appeals are determined by the same state agency that issued the violations to begin with, a lot of times the very same officer. And it's just, if we're going to have a system where we could potentially shut a motor carrier down, we cannot tie it to an appeal system where the appeals are adjudicated by the same state agency that issued them in the first place. My thoughts.
No, and you're not wrong. You're basically asking a state agency to say at that point, yeah, we were wrong. And that becomes the big issue, is how often is that going to happen? My son tells me all the time, Dad, you're always right, aren't you? I'm like, every day you wake up, I am. But it's that same basic principle. You're asking that state agency to say, yep, I was wrong in doing that. And that's not always going to happen. They're not going to go against themselves. And at the same point, you have different levels of carriers who may be better at data queuing than other carriers could be. And as well as I do. It would be a different
story if they had an appeals board or some kind of FMCSA oversight where you could appeal to the next level. But we've sued the FMCSA in the past on this issue, specifically saying we should be able to challenge these in court because the FMCSA is not stepping in and it's leaving erroneous data out there on its systems, and carriers are being judged by that erroneous data, and the courts have refused to step in. So I think that's the thing that has to be taken care of first and foremost, if we're going to even contemplate this, is figuring out a better way for carriers to have due process in this system.
And based on my experience, how hard certain carriers are willing to fight to protect that safety rating. And if you're going to escalate even more motor carriers into that purgatory, as you call it, Dave, I like that, that could result in a ton of work, a tidal weight of work for the FMCSA, which is already basically saying we can't keep up with the compliance reviews that we're trying to do at this point.
Yeah. Let's see what Jack has to say here. Our friend Jack from FMCSA, former FMCSA, recently retired. Congrats, Jack, on the retirement.
I think he's sitting poolside at this point.
Yeah, sipping on a nice cool beverage, hopefully. At a public meeting with CVSA, there was discussion of FMCSA taking over the appeal process specific to data queues. I would love to see that.
Oh, yes.
That's what it should be.
Please.
Yeah, please do that. Jack, exert your influence over that and make that happen, please. But anyway, I think that would alleviate some of my concerns with tying them to CSA scores if we had a better appellate system, because we still have, with safety ratings now, there's an appeals process that goes along with it. There's actually two processes available to carriers that get a downgraded safety rating. You have the 385.15 appeal process, which is essentially almost like a court proceeding. You file your appeal with the FMCSA's headquarters. It gets reviewed by the chief safety officer, which was Jack in the past, and ruled on. You get to submit your briefs, you get to submit your evidence, and there's actually due process. And then there's the 385.17 process, which is a safety rating upgrade based on corrective actions. You're essentially admitting the violations, but you have taken corrective actions to fix those problems, and you're begging the FMCSA for mercy. And so I imagine that whatever system we get eventually, and this is one of the questions I know FMCSA is asking, is do we need to make changes to those 385.15 and 385.17 processes? I think you probably do. Back in 2016, if I remember correctly, they were envisioning a corrective action process similar to what we have now, but they were going to make the motor carrier, as a condition to upgrading their rating from unfit to fit, they were going to make them sign a consent agreement, essentially a contract with FMCSA, where they agreed to keep their CSA scores below the intervention thresholds over a certain amount of time. And if they didn't, then that unfit rating would come back to life. So it's things like those that just really cause me a lot of heartburn, but I guess we'll just have to submit our comments on that point and hope it plays out for the best.
Yeah, and notably that appeals process is, in my experience, really rare to actually go through that process. It's most oftentimes that safety management plan that the motor carrier would submit, which is actually a whole lot of work on the motor carrier's part. A lot of motor carriers don't understand how much work that actually is to go through that process and to do it well.
Jack says no more influence.
Oh, man.
Oh, too bad, Jack. All right. So that's kind of the current status of things. I know there were several questions being asked in the ANPRM. If anybody's interested in checking out what exactly the questions are, we've got an article on it at trucksafe.com. You could see, I think they're asking a dozen or so questions. I wanted to ask you, Dave, how do you we've kind of already talked about this in pieces, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on a better way to assess a larger swath of motor carrier safety fitness, if it's not just CSA scores. Have you given thought to a better way that we can assess safety fitness other than CSA scores?
And there has to be caveats in there that truly have their roots in safety, right? And I alluded to some aspects of it. Certainly beyond compliance does have an issue. What is the carrier doing to indeed make themselves safer? I mean, compliance is one thing, safety is an entirely a different beast altogether. So do they have cameras on their trucks? Forward-facing cameras at best, inward-facing cameras, which are starting to get into the industry now for those that have put them on there. But, what other pieces of technology? As I said, we're in the midst of a rulemaking on AEB, but there are carriers that have had AEB on their trucks for years now. I mean, where are the bonus points for those? So while they're in the business of catching people to rate them safety, how does that incorporate into that performance or that safety fitness? And where is that blue ribbon safety operator that kind of operates on our roadways today? How come we're not highlighting some of those things? I think, with the bad, you still got to look for the good too. You got to highlight the good players as well. And I think this is that opportunity to really incorporate that. Yep, performance is one thing, and what you see at the roadside and what those inspectors are seeing versus the equipment that they're pulling over and taking a look at. I get that, and I understand that, and that should play a role in it because it is reflective of what's going on the roads as we speak right now. But there also has to be aspects of safety management practices and safety culture incorporated to that, which shows in some of the technology that carriers are putting on their trucks right now.
Brian's asking, is there a thought of making anything less than a full audit to get a rating? Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we talked about. It would essentially be, how can, that's what the FMCSA is asking essentially. How can we do this? How can we assign a safety rating without having to do the full blown audit? The most obvious way is tying it to CSA data, which is again what they tried to do in 2016. And so I guess we'll just have to wait and see how this plays out.
We're coming out of that COVID environment where they were doing the focused audits too, that were not on-site, full-blown on-site compliance reviews. They're doing focused audits. So does that play a role into it so that they can touch more people in less time to basically come up with a better system? But I think there's a whole bunch of things that need to be included in this type of program if they're going to paint that picture. Let's paint that picture and do so in the most accurate way possible so that you are seeing the entire safety performance of the carrier in question.
And speaking of those offsite audits, the remote audits that the FMCSA has certainly been ramping up, have you noticed in your membership that you've had any of your members getting on-site audits, or have you been hearing that it's all offsite or remote audits for the most part?
The ones I've been hearing have been all remote audits. I haven't heard of any doing a compliance review, coming out and visiting them. And again, some of these folks haven't had a review in 30 years. So it becomes a question of what's going on next? Where do they go from there? And I'm not saying all of a sudden you have to start going down that road and visiting everybody with an expiration date. No, when they don't have the manpower to do that. But the reality is there's got to be a better way. And certainly some of those focused reviews are probably one of those ways they can do that.
Yeah. But it is important to remember that CSA is essentially the prioritization system. That's what it's intended to do. It's intended to float to the top the worst performing motor carriers so that then they could be targeted for an audit and then ultimately potentially a safety rating. And that's kind of the whole idea is if we don't have the manpower as the agency to get out and audit a significant number of motor carriers, we need some way to prioritize the worst offending so that we can go out and audit them. And CSA has always kind of been that prioritization system, at least since 2010. And there have been studies over the years, including the National Academy of Sciences study that was just recently released on how effective it is at actually doing that. And that's kind of what FMCSA is addressing with their recent proposed changes to CSA, and trying to, always iterate with it and make it more effective at doing that job. So I think there is still room for that type of system where we've got a way to prioritize the worst offending motor carriers and then do an audit of the worst performing and get them a safety rating. I don't think it necessarily has to move entirely over to a system that's based entirely on CSA. I think there still has to be some room to put eyes on the motor carriers that we're potentially going to assign a safety rating, because we all know here, but maybe folks don't realize the consequences of a unsatisfactory safety rating, or unfit as it would be proposed in 2016, is that your entire fleet gets shut down. It's a fleet-wide shutdown order. You are prohibited from operating. And so, doing something that extreme where we're going to potentially shut down a carrier based on CSA data, which studies and folks in the industry have shown over the years is not all that reliable. There are problems with it. Brian here is mentioning one of them, which we have heard a lot about over the years. There's a disparity in enforcement from state to state. So depending on where certain carriers operate could show a difference in the sheer number of violations. That's one that's been raised since 2010. This idea that if I'm a carrier that has a lot of operations in Indiana, then my unsafe driving basic is going to be relatively higher than carriers in other countries because Indiana has so many speeding violations relative to other states. It's not fair to treat that carrier differently because they happen to be in a state where their drivers get stopped more frequently and get written up for speeding violations than other states. So it's just little issues like that when you start to add them up that cause the concern, I think, from my perspective.
Yeah, and you do need an equal playing field depending on the state that you're operating in order for this to truly work. You may have seen one of those freight heat maps or whatnot pre-CSA, and then it changes where the freight obviously goes around Indiana so that they're avoiding what I call a CSA aggressive state. So that because not every state is the same. And yeah, you highlight that very issue. States are not the same when they report some of these things. Some are more aggressive than others, and that's one of those geographical biases that is CSA, and certainly comes into play when you're looking at some of these systems.
And interestingly, that FMCSA specifically declined to take any action on that issue with the CSA proposed changes. They specifically say in their notice where they are proposing changes, tweaks to the CSA program, that they're not doing anything with the disparate treatment among the states. I can't remember what their rationale was for that, but I remember that distinctly.
Yep. And even Jack just said in the chats, as I'm reading it too, there's a huge range disparity in both inspection violation and out of service violations across all the states. So yeah, without a doubt, it exists. There's no doubt about that in my mind. It's been around forever. I think everybody knows about it. So the question is how do you put something like this in a safety fitness determination when we've already just talked about the way CSA comes up short? And don't get me wrong, there's bad apples in our industry, and I think we all can admit that. We've all heard the horror stories of that. And how do we get rid of those players becomes the biggest question, not necessarily penalize the great ones, but get rid of the bad ones. And that's the angle we got to look at when it comes from this, because we all know a ton of great carriers out there that are operating on the roads today. We need to continually put them on the pedestal and get the bad actors out of the industry.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right. With whatever the solution we ultimately land on, it needs to take into account that beyond compliance. It's something we've talked about, as you said, for decades at this point, giving carriers credit where credit is due for the things that they do that goes beyond and above and beyond what the regulations require of them, because that's what we're doing with safety fitness. We're trying to punish the unsafe carriers. So it just seems natural that we should be giving some credit to carriers that go beyond what they are required to make the roads more safe. And we're just currently not doing that. Do you have something else?
Yeah, I was going to ask, since this ANPRM dropped last week, Dave, have you started receiving comments from your members? And if yes, what kind of hot button questions are they touching on?
Well, the comments I've gotten, are they really coming back out with this right now? I mean, I thought this was a dead issue. And the one comment I've had was, it's been on the agenda forever. I think they're finally just getting around to doing something with it. So yeah, we haven't dove into the specifics yet of that. I know we're going to be doing a little bit of that at our fall business meeting here in Washington, D.C. The timeline sets up perfectly to discuss this. So we'll have that conversations with members live and in person. But I think most are just, what are the chances of them really moving forward with this? And the only thing that we have to go on is past performance always equals future performance. And the past one shows that in 2016, they weren't able to get it right. Here we are, 2023, they're coming out with it again. And what's that avenue to go forward? And certainly there are shortcomings, which we've already discussed, and those shortcomings still exist. They existed back then. They exist today. And does that change? And are they willing to move with some of those other caveats to start looking at this? It's anybody's ball game at this. It's an advance notice, so it's very early in the stage, right? It's kind of trying to get to that bullseye, and this is throwing the dart and at least trying to hit the wall, not necessarily the dartboard. So it's one of those situations just to try to get more and better information what industry's thinking on this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with the process, so this is an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. They're essentially just soliciting public input on kind of what are some ideas that the public has. If the next step in the process would be for them to review all of the comments that they receive, and then potentially put together a notice of proposed rulemaking where they outline specifically what they're thinking in terms of a potential rule change. Then they would open up for comments again. and then they would evaluate those comments, and eventually, if they feel like they can progress to the next stage, they would issue a final rule. And that's just kind of how the regulatory process tends to play out. But like you said, Dave, we're very early on here. It's still necessary that we have these conversations, and they are looking for our input. So I have no doubt that TCA and you, Dave, will be putting together your comments. You'll be working with your members to come up with some ideas and putting together your comments to file with the agency. Again, I recommend anybody listening, if you have any thoughts on this, be sure to get your comments in, because this is our way to affect change with the regulations that may be problematic to us. So it's important that we participate in the process. Dave, we are running out of time. We really appreciate you joining us. Really enjoyed the conversation. A lot to look forward to here with this potential rulemaking, and we'll be interested in watching your thoughts on it and what you have to say about it here in the future. Where can folks learn more about what you guys are doing over at TCA, or get in touch with you if they have any questions?
They can find everything they want to know at truckload.org, or just follow Jerad wherever he's speaking. Usually I'm speaking as well. So at the same point, we'll bump into each other from time to time. But yeah, anything they want to know about TCA and what we're working on, they can see right at truckload.org, right on our website.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thanks
for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care. All right. Well, we'll have to see. Like most things that we talk about, it's kind of a waiting game at this point. You just have to wait and see how it plays out. But we will continue to put together some ideas on the topic, and I know we're going to work on preparing our own comments. If anybody's interested in teaming up with us in some capacity to put together comments for you, feel free to reach out. You can get in touch with us over at trucksafe.com. Anything else we need to talk about here?
No, I think we covered it. It's a good show.
Good show. Appreciate everybody who tuned in and participated. You can check out our prior episodes over at trucksafelive.com. You can subscribe to the podcast wherever you happen to get your podcast, and look out for our next shows. Not sure what our next show is going to be on, but it'll be in a couple weeks probably. Best way to keep up to date on that is either at trucksafelive.com or subscribing to our newsletter to get updates about future shows. So anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. We'll see you guys next time.